Yes.
Dr Motley, I want to move on to consider some of the organisational aspects of the service. You've said in your statement that before 1988, the term National Blood Transfusion Service was at best a euphemism and probably better described as a misnomer. What did you mean by that?
Well, to me, the term National Blood Transfusion Service suggests that it was a national organisation which was funded like, I don't know, National Ties or I suppose the National Health Service. Whereas in fact, although the transfusion centres attempted to develop high clinical standards that were in line with each other, because of the funding arrangements that had been set up originally, it was up to each local director to persuade their regional health authority, or I think in one case a district health authority, which was even more difficult, of the pressing need for the development in transfusion, competing with all the other clinical developments that were going on in the region at the time. And of course, because people are different, the regional responses might be different.
Your appointment to Liverpool coincided with Dr Gunson's appointment as National Transfusion Director, is that right?
Yes, it was quite a shock for Manchester.
And when you were
I got appointed on Thursday and I did on the following Monday, you see.
When you were at Liverpool, you've said the Liverpool Centre cooperated with the National Directorate in relation to the national coordination of stocks. Can you tell us what that involved?
Well, we were required to get a fax machine. Believe it or not, I know they've all gone out, but they were quite a novelty at the time. And we faxed daily stocks into the National Directorate to Dr Moore, who compiled them so that if anybody was short of anything, centrally they would know who could bail them out, which was much more efficient than just ringing round, which was what would have gone on before, choosing your nearest neighbour first, of course.
And you've said in your statement that the National Directorate had to lead by persuasion because they lacked a national budget. From your perspective, what was your understanding of the difficulties that the Directorate faced?
Well, first of all, I don't think there wasn't direct accountability of the directors to the national directors. I understood it. My accountability remained to the regional health authority. The contract didn't change, so the national director did not have managerial responsibility, and of course he didn't have any control at all of the funding. Although, I suppose, if he could persuade people to come together a bit more, there would be more strength in persuading a region of a national direction with sort of that kind of authority. But it was very difficult.
You've said that the need for reform had generally been acknowledged by regional transfusion directors for some time. What was the understanding of the regional transfusion directors of what was needed?
Some sort of central organisation that had a budget for transfusion service and could sort of allocate geographically according to national direction, I think. I think that's what was intended.
And when you were first appointed to Liverpool, to what extent did you have direct dealings with the Welsh office or the Welsh Chief Medical Officer?
Well, not that long after I started, and it has now finally happened. There was a working party. I remember going to a meeting in Welshpool with people from the Welsh office, and it was considered sensitive in employment terms, I think, about the possibility of their taking over the Welsh teams and collecting blood from them. And I think that after I went, that did happen, I think, in the 21st century.
But while you were at the Liverpool Centre, what involvement or oversight did they have of the Welsh elements of the work of the centre?
None, really, I don't think. I don't think so. I mean, I don't know if any statistics went in centrally that I didn't know about, but...
But as far as you were concerned, you were accountable and responsible to the regional health authority, as in the Mersey authority.
That's right. But of course, once the change in the health service happened, was it 1990, with the purchase of providers bit, the whole thing got a little bit more complicated.
I want to pick up that point. Could we have NHBT 40193_084, please? This is a letter from the 12th of December 1991 from you to Dr Gunson. It reads as follows. Thank you for your inquiry about funding for HCV antibody screening. Mersey region funded this in full 1991-92 and will fund 75% 1992-93, the remainder being obtained in products issued to Welsh hospitals. This change has been made in response to an agreement between treasurers at the Department of Health and in the Welsh office that the funding for healthcare in Wales will be provided from within the Principality. Now, I want to come back to the point about HCV screening, but in relation to the funding, can you explain for us what the situation was here in relation to the Welsh funding?
Well, by that time, do you know, I can't remember if the purchase of provider split applied to Wales, but by that time in Merseyside, the GPs notionally and clinical commissioning groups were provided with all the funding for their patients. And then the secondary services and indeed tertiary services recovered that from them. So instead of hospitals having a budget, they recovered their money from the money held in primary care, because this was based on I think on patient choice. I can't remember if that applied to Wales, but either way, the arrangements that the Mersey region had set up for their own hospitals, they had no jurisdiction over in Wales.
So how was the Welsh work generally funded?
So presumably the Mersey region would then recover the 25% from the Principality, whether they got it from their Welsh GPs or from their secondary care budget. I can't remember that bit, but I remember what we were doing in England.
In the early 90s, the National Blood Authority was then created and assumed full responsibility for the centres. And at that point, the lines of accountability for you changed. Is that right?
Yes. So I was managerially accountable to Mr. Adey, who was the Chief Executive of the Authority, and professionally to Dr Gunson, who was its Medical Director.
And then in 1994, when the zonal arrangements came into place, you became Director of Donor Services for the Northern Zone. So
in that case, I'd have been accountable to Dr Wagstaff, who was the Chief Executive of that, and any professional activity would have been accountable to Dr Flanagan, who was the Medical Director of the Northern Zone.
And at that point in time, what was the position in relation to the Welsh part of the Liverpool service?
I think everything to do with the National Blood Authority to start with, including North Wales. So that the activity of the Liverpool Centre was still supplying North Wales.
And then just for completeness' sake, in 1994, the plan was for the Liverpool Centre to close, with it just holding a small stock of blood and blood components prepared from local donors.
Yes.
And the processing and testing was due to move to Manchester.
Yes, which it finally did, I think, in 97.
But the centre was also relocated to Speke as a new purpose-built.
Yes, it stayed open. Yes.
So, and at that new purpose-built centre, there was a tissue bank, the National Frozen Blood Bank, reference and reagents laboratories, and a blood bank.
Yes, and some clinical advice to the 2 or 3 consultants there, I think, still on there.
I want to go back in time a little now. Obviously, you didn't join Liverpool until 1988, but you provided an update for the HIV litigation about your understanding of the practices at the centre before you joined. And I just want to have a look at...
I did that with the help of Dr Shepherd, because he was there at the time.
that was going to be my first question, Dr Motley, of how you found out the information for that document. It was with Dr Shepherd.
Yes.
Could we have that up? NHBT 00-18153, please. And we can see that you're responding to some form of questionnaire in relation to HIV litigation update. If we can just look at the middle of the page, you've recorded that on the introduction of AIDS leaflets, which have subsequently been updated on a number of occasions, the Mersey and North Wales Regional Transfusion Service took steps to see that these were circulated to all donors from September 1983. They were available on sessions and circulated with donor invitations from that time. And then from October 14th, 1985, all blood donations issued have been screened for HIV antibodies and found to be negative. So that was your understanding of the position at that time?
Yes.
If we then turn on to page 7 of this document, and we pick up at the top of the page, you've noted that in the Mersey region, Dr Shepherd prepared a notice for circulation to clinicians for advising patients about the risk of transfusion-transmitted disease. A leaflet prepared in the Welsh region was also circulated for information to the consultant haematologists. This is picking up what happened in 1987, so a little bit later in the piece. But again, that was your understanding of the practice in the region before you arrived. Is that right?
Yes, and I'm wondering whether that second sentence means that Dr Shepherd ensured that there were some translated into Welsh.
We've got a copy of the leaflet, that leaflet prepared in the Welsh region. It's worth looking at it, if we may. NHBT 0110455_002, please. It's in English in the copy we have, but if we turn to the final page, we can see that it was a leaflet prepared by Dr Napier.
Yes.
Director of the Welsh Regional Transfusion Service. And if we go back to the the second page of the leaflet, the first substantive page, we can see that it sets out that recent articles in newspapers and programmes on radio and television have made us acutely aware of the possibility of catching AIDS from blood transfusions. This publicity has made many patients and their relatives worried about whether they will need to have a blood transfusion and whether there's any real danger that they will become infected with the AIDS virus. Of course, the media are absolutely right to draw our attention to these problems. Unfortunately, this publicity can also make us worried out of all proportion to the true risks. Partly this reflects the exaggerated emphasis and dramatic headlines of some of the media coverage. It's therefore most important to get the true facts into perspective. Very few cases of AIDS have actually occurred from blood transfusions in the United Kingdom. Most of these occurred before the cause of AIDS was discovered and before screening tests could be introduced. And then figures are given in relation to the screening process. And on the next page, the transfusion, there's a set of steps that the transfusion service has taken, and then as a last step, your doctor will only give you a blood transfusion if it's clearly needed for your recovery. So from the document we looked at a moment ago, it was your understanding that although this had been produced by the Welsh Regional Transfusion Service, it had in fact been circulated to haematologists across the Mersey and North Wales region.
I think so, but that would be information from Dr Shepherd.
So in preparing the update on the HIV litigation, you were relying entirely on what Dr Shepherd could tell you about the process before you arrived?
About that, because it was 1987, yes.
Absolutely. Then I want to pick up the hepatitis B core antigen testing. Liverpool started undertaking core antigen testing in May 1989, is that right?
I'm not sure about the exact date, but yes, it may well be. I mean, it was 90, yeah.
Now, at that time, hepatitis B surface antigen testing was standard procedure.
Yes, had been for many years.
What was the aim or the concern that this study in relation to core antigen testing was focused on?
For a very small proportion of donors who test negative for hepatitis B surface antigen, who retain in their blood a very small amount of hepatitis B, which is below the level of detection of that test, which of course is done on quite a small portion of the donation, but a pint of which can transmit hepatitis B to the recipient. Now, there is more than one antibody raised to hepatitis B in the natural recovery from the virus. And hepatitis B core antibody is a marker of previous infection. Now, so that anybody who is hepatitis B core antibody positive has had a natural infection. They haven't had protective immunization. And a very small proportion of them may still have a low level of virus. So you can use the core antibody to find out who those possible people might be, and then screen them further to see whether in fact they are still carrying the virus,
so
whether their donation is safe.
So when you identified a donor as hepatitis B core antibody positive, what happened to them? What happened next?
They underwent their donation would be held to one side, obviously discarded, and then they would have further screening to look at hepatitis B surface antibody, and some of them were then, if they didn't have adequate surface antibody, they would then be referred for further, more sophisticated screening to see if there was any evidence of the virus.
But just to be clear, at that time when you were undertaking this pilot study, this was because you had a discrete concern about hepatitis B transmission.
Absolutely.
It wasn't being used as a form of surrogate testing for hepatitis C.
Not at all. No, it was to improve the hepatitis B screening.
Could we turn to DHSC 304709_153, please? It's a letter dated the 7th of October 1993 from Dr Gunson to all regional transfusion directors. And it's headed anti-HBC testing of blood donations, and it records the decision of the MSBT discussion. And it says it was decided that the routine testing of all blood donations could not be justified at the present time, and then gives a number of reasons why. Roman 1, all ELISA tests for anti-HBC gave false positive results. 2, there was no agreed satisfactory confirmatory tests, which means that there will be an inability to provide definitive health information to a considerable number of donors. 3, the provision of standards, particularly a go-no-go standard for anti-HBS, will be a major problem. 4, it's difficult to estimate the number of instances of transmission of HBV which will be prevented with the introduction of anti-HBC screening. It's been suggested that the maximum will be in the order of 100 per year, but could be as low as 10. Also, the morbidity is ill-defined since many instances may be subclinical. 5, approximately £3 million per year will have to be added to the cost of blood products from the RTCs, since central funding will not be available. Then over the page. 6, there was concern about the withdrawal of plasma from containing anti-HBC and or anti-HBs from the pools for fractionated products. And 7, anti-HBC testing is not widespread in Europe. And then at the end of the letter, he notes that MSBT will keep the question of anti-HBC testing under review. So it's right, isn't it, Dr Motley, that at the end of 1993 you were instructed to stop the pilot study?
Yes.
And you had some concerns about that?
Well, I was bitterly disappointed because obviously a very small number of people would continue to transmit hepatitis B, a small number of donors.
Can I just come back, if I may, to the first page of that document? I'm a little puzzled, and you can help, because it's obviously my own failure to understand what's happening. But the conclusion is expressed in 1, that all ELISA tests give false positive results. But if one look at 2, that there's no agreed satisfactory confirmatory tests, that might suggest that there was no way of knowing by testing whether the result was falsely positive. So how could you say with certainty that they were false positive results if you couldn't actually have another test that told you that? How did they determine that the virus had actually been transmitted?
I'm not a virologist, but I understand that at that time they were looking for the Dane particle, and subsequently they'd have been able, not too long after that, being able to do PCR. That time I think they were looking for the Delta particle, the Dane particle, which was a measure of infection. There were further investigations.
That will be a further test. I mean, the Dane particle had existed, had been known about since early 70s, hasn't it?
But that's my understanding. But as I say, I'm not a virologist.
Yes, I'll just mark that as a puzzle for someone else to explain to me in due course. But thank you.
You've said you were very disappointed that the pilot study was being stopped, and you also sought legal advice about whether that was an appropriate decision. For the transcript, your letter to the solicitor is NHBT 00199425_002. What we're going to pick up is the reply to your letter, NHBT 00199425_001, please. Dated the 5th of November 1993, and we pick it up in the second paragraph and the third paragraph. Dr Gunson's letter appears to me to indicate that managerially he feels that on the basis of his paragraphs numbered 1 to 7, that on balance the service should not continue with hepatitis B core antibody testing of the sort referred to in your letter of 21st October. It's not for me to intermeddle in the managerial decisions of the National Blood Transfusion Service. However, as a matter of law, I apprehend that at some time in the future, the decision could be challenged within the context of legal proceedings for damages by an infected recipient of NBTS blood products. And then if we go over the page, the decision, therefore, to discontinue the testing referred to in your letter of 21st October is one that may in due course be judicially tested and compared or contrasted with the arrangements in North America and the rest of the Western world. There's then reference to the Consumer Protection Act and the HIV litigation. And then finally, when therefore finalising the decisions relating to hepatitis B testing, I'd invite you and your colleagues to consider the possible legal implications to which I refer above. That was the letter you received from a solicitor. You then forwarded that to Dr Gunson. And again, for the transcript, that letter to Dr Gunson is NHBT 00194424. And you also spoke to Dr Gunston about your concerns about stopping the core testing. What was his response?
Well, I mean, I think he set out the view in the letter, and I think he felt that a decision had made. I can't remember if he said it had been decided in the Department of Health or not, but I just got the impression it had been decided at a higher level and we'd have to stop. And I was very disappointed because, to me, it felt like a quality improvement, and we'd been doing it for about 2 years plus. But I was very disappointed.
You also say in your statement that ALT testing was being undertaken in Liverpool in relation to plasma donors. Is that right?
Yes.
Again, can you tell us a little bit more of how that operated in Liverpool?
Well, as a health protection for donors, we would check liver function tests and a blood count plasma donors every 6 months or so anyway, because they were giving a lot of plasma and there were anticoagulant solutions leaving the procedure just to make sure that their health was maintained. So that's one aspect of it. But we received a request from BPL to ALT screen our plasma donors because I think there was a potential that they might be using their plasma intermediates differently, and it was some sort of license requirement. They were prepared to pay for the laboratory costs of that, but that was my understanding.
So again, just to be clear, the purpose of it was the health protection of the donors and a license requirement of BPL. It wasn't being used for all donations as a surrogate test for hepatitis C in Liverpool.
All red cell donations? No. It was being, as I say, initially we were doing it just for the donors, but that was every 6 months. But the BPL request, I think, was for every donation.
Moving on to before we move on to hepatitis C screening, I just want to pick up one matter in relation to post-transfusion hepatitis. When a doctor reported to the centre that a patient had suffered from post-transfusion hepatitis, is it right that the Liverpool Centre used the J system?
No, I can't remember. I can tell you that the Manchester system did.
Can I take you to a document? Let me take you to a document to help refresh your memory.
We set up a new description of a new use for the J system at some stage while I was there. The old J system, I think, had been going for years and years and years, almost before testing for hepatitis B, designating donors with a history of hepatitis to be J donors, not collected. Then they were reinstated, but we used it to make a note of donors who have been tested for everything and found negative, but had somehow been that one of the donations had been implicated in the case of post-transfusion hepatitis.
Let's take it in stages. Let me refresh your memory. NHBT 5060_019. A letter from you to Dr Gunston dated the 19th of June 1990, and we see you say this: thank you very much for your inquiry about our standard operating procedure for the handling of cases of post-transfusion jaundice. I'm pleased you brought this matter to my attention. I've been operating off my old recollections of the famous J system, but realised there was no local modification of this in print here. It's given me I think it should say chance, to put thoughts down on paper, and I've pleasure in sending you a copy of the result. I expect it will look rather familiar. Dr Motley, we don't have, as yet, we haven't been able to identify the document you sent with this letter, but we do have NHBT 305387_002, which is from 1986 and looks to be, well, we'll look at it and you can tell me if it's broadly similar. J system, if we go over the page, we have a note here. Donors involved in a case of post-transfusion jaundice. When a case of post-transfusion jaundice occurs, we're notified by the medical staff from the hospital concerned, and provided it appears to be a genuine case, the following procedures are adopted. 1. Take the list of donation numbers given by the hospital to blood bank office and find out from the numerical list of donation numbers when the units were bled. Write these down, then go to the respective Bibles and find out the donors' names, blood groups and sessions, checking carefully you have the correct donors. Then it sets out the process of obtaining the records and starting a file. Then if we go down to 4, make out page for black book. What was the black book? Did you have anything like that?
I'm not sure what that was, unless it was a whole, book which has got all the post-transfusion hepatitis in it.
Make
I have
out
no
a
memory of that book.
Make out a J donor card for each donor.
Yeah.
What was that?
It was a card saying that they'd been implicated in a post-transfusion jaundice.
And then make out the master index cards. And in so doing, check the master index to see if donors have been implicated in a previous case or are on another system.
Yes, and then I think they were deferred if they. I think it was a sort of 2 strikes and you're out, because what was the date on it again? 87.
1986, May 86.
86. Yeah. So it's well pre hepatitis C specific screening. So I think that was the purpose of it. The original J donor system was years earlier and related to history of jaundice, I think.
And then if we go over the page, point 7, if necessary and only at the request of one of the medical staff, arrange for the donors to be brought in for additional samples. When would a donor be brought in for additional samples?
Well, if obviously you'd be repeating hepatitis B screening on all the aliquots, but in order to investigate further, if you wanted to do liver function tests or something like that, you'd bring the donor in. You'd only be able to do virology on the stored sample.
And we see in 8, after retesting, if one or more positive donors are found in a case, these donors are withdrawn and the others can then be reinstated. The donors' records can then be returned to the RDO with the instruction either that they should be withdrawn for medical reasons or can be reinstated as normal.
Yes.
9, if no...
But the memory of their participation is...
And that's because of the J donor card?
Yeah.
So even if...
Because if it happened, the same person, you see, if it happened again, in the absence of a specific test, you would probably withdraw the donor then.
So if somebody is implicated once, they get the J donor card, but are reinstated if on testing it doesn't implicate them. But yes. if their donor number comes up a second time, then they would be withdrawn.
Yeah.
And we see that, I think, in point 9. If no positive donor is found in a case, the donor's records must be marked J before they're returned to the RDO with the instruction to bleed as normal. And then it deals with the filing of all the cards and the correspondence.
Computer, I'm afraid.
Sorry, I missed that.
It's pre-computer, I'm afraid.
I'm aware that this isn't the precise document you sent to Dr Gunson under cover of the letter that we looked at a moment ago, but does that represent broadly the J system that
Yes.
you had in operation in Liverpool?
Yes, that's the later one, yes.
And just in terms of how often that was operated, how frequently Was the centre informed of a post-transfusion jaundice case by clinicians?
Oh, not very often at all. And I think that's probably because, many people with hepatitis are completely asymptomatic.
I want to move on to hepatitis C testing. Could we have NHBT 40188_027, please? This is a letter from you to Dr Simpson, the Regional Medical Officer, on the 24th of August 1989, and you say this: the new test for antibodies to hepatitis C, the title which has recently been conferred upon one of the causes of non-A, non-B hepatitis, has caught the public interest today with a feature in The Guardian and coverage on Radio 4 Today programme. You deal with when the test was first declared. And you say, I enclose for your information 3 articles from The Lancet of the 5th of August 1989, reporting work from Spain and the Netherlands, together with a critical editorial review. It would seem that in Europe, the prevalence of antibodies to hepatitis C in the healthy population are around 1.2%. At the moment, a 3-centre study of surrogate testing for non-A, non-B hepatitis in the form of alanine transaminase assay, ALT, and detection of antibodies to hepatitis B core antigen, it is drawing to a close. Just pausing there, that 3-centre study in relation to surrogate testing was something you'd been involved in at Manchester. Is that right?
Before I sort of setting it up before I left, but in fact it started, I think, just a few weeks before I moved to Liverpool, collecting the samples.
But as you say, once you moved to Liverpool, your involvement in that ceased?
Yes, practically, yes.
And then if we turn the page, you set out where the study was being undertaken: Bristol, Manchester and London. And then this. My impression at the moment concurs with that of the editor of The Lancet, in that screening for anti-HCV will identify many carriers of non-A, non-B hepatitis, but that this virus is probably one of the causes of that condition. The problem, of course, which arises in introducing a new screening test of this sort is the planning of appropriate confirmatory testing and follow-up of donors who must reasonably be withdrawn if they're considered to be carriers of this transmitted disease. At the moment, I do not believe there are facilities for appropriate confirmatory testing available, and it wouldn't therefore be appropriate to introduce screening immediately. Again, just pausing there, the lack of confirmatory testing as a reason not to introduce screening, can you explain to us what your thinking was in relation to that?
I think similar to HIV, really. We would be introducing a new screening test. We didn't know how many donors there would be, and obviously, if the screening test came up positive, you would discard the donation, but you would have to determine whether or not that you thought the donors were truly infected before approaching them and withdrawing them.
If there wasn't a confirmatory test available, was there not perhaps a middle ground, Dr Martlew, of discarding the donation and informing the donor that matters were somewhat equivocal?
Yes, I mean, that is a middle ground. In my experience, some donors might be very happy to accept that and it wouldn't bother them at all. Some donors would be very, very concerned, I think. I think it's difficult to approach them when you haven't got a few answers. So I suppose we would then have to just defer them till we had confirmatory testing. But it would be improper to call them up to donate if we weren't going to use the donation. So we would have had to say something to them. And as I say, people are variable in their response to that sort of communication. Some get very distressed indeed.
The letter then continues in addressing the risks of transmission, and at the bottom of the page you note, sorry if we go back a page, at the last paragraph you note the other difficulty lies in the anticipated loss of 1.2% of our donor population if the figures for the United Kingdom concur for those in other parts of Europe. This is yet another very good reason for energetic recruiting of blood donors both locally and nationally. So would a fair reading of this be that your expectation was that if you did lose 1.2% of your donor population, with good recruiting, you could address that loss?
One would hope so, yes. 1% isn't too bad. And with people getting older and perhaps having to withdraw for medical reasons, you're having to recruit a substantial number of new donors every year too.
And then if we go over the page, you say, this week I received notice from Dr Gunson of an estimated cost for the screening procedure. This is estimated to be about £1.50 per test, and our anticipated workload for the financial year 1990-1991 is 145,000 donations of varying sorts, 125,000 units of blood, and 20,000 plasmapheresis procedures. With the necessary provision for documentation and follow-up of donors, the funding required for this additional screening test would therefore be in the region of £220,000. It's quite likely that a more favourable figure might be achieved by national negotiation, but this remains to be seen. And you indicate that you're flagging it at this stage, given the media attention.
Partly because of the media attention, partly because it was a lot of money which was coming from the region. And I thought it would be a good idea that the regional medical officer had sort of got this in the back of his mind, that it was there would be a requirement to find that money soon, if you know what I mean.
And then picking up a letter from you to Dr Gunson, NHBT 5073_034, please. It's a letter dated the 24th of January 1991 that you say, thank you for your rapid communication concerning antibody testing for hepatitis C virus. We're very pleased that the Department of Health have finally agreed that the routine testing of all donations is indicated. If I just pause there, that use of the word finally agreed might suggest some impatience on your part for testing to start. Would that be fair?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we were all keen to get screening introduced as soon as we could. Yes.
And was it your view in January 1991 that it could have got started sooner?
By that time, the first trial, the trial on the first generation kits had been completed, and the results were not wonderful. I don't know if we could have gone any quicker than that. But of course, the problem we had then was that it also withdrew those kits.
The letter continues. As you'll know, BPL has decided to discontinue its supply of hepatitis B surface antigen testing by the RIA method, with effect from the 31st of March 1991. As a result of this, we are changing over to an ELISA method on the 1st of April. We're therefore reluctant to introduce two new technologies together and have been advised by representatives of Ortho that it will be difficult to deliver before mid-summer. What you said in your statement that the Liverpool Centre did change the technology to ELISA in April 1991. Is that right?
For the hepatitis B surface antigen test, yes, we started that in April.
What was the difficulty in introducing two new technologies together?
Well, we were changing technology, and then introducing a second test. So the we thought the best thing was to use the new technology on the established test and then do the new test on the then established new technology, if you see what I mean.
We would therefore, the letter continues, we therefore prefer to delay the implementation of testing to the 1st of August 1991 for all donations, on the understanding that, of course, this will have to be preceded by a 5-week period of testing to assure that all products in the bank at that time have been tested for these antibodies and found to be negative. Again, just pausing there, as at January 1991, it appears that Liverpool would have been ready to implement testing in August 91, so before the nationally agreed date of September. Is that right?
Yes, and of course that's taking into consideration that actually we'll be doing some testing from the end of June, I suppose, to get the frozen stuff tested.
And then final paragraph. Clearly, our budget will not support such a scheme, which will involve an additional revenue outlay of approximately £450,000 per annum. Sorry, go on.
I just don't know why it had gone up. I'm just thinking.
Yes, you've got no recollection of why the figures were substantially greater?
Double. No.
May I just ask something? It's about the nature of the test, which until the 31st of March 1991 was in use in order to test for hepatitis B surface antigen. RIA stands for radioimmunoassay, doesn't it?
It does.
So it involves a radioactive substance.
Yes.
My understanding is that there is at least a claim and possibly a reason why, when it was introduced, testing for HDLV3, as it was then known, could have been done by RIA and was in fact done by an ELISA form of testing, because it was thought that RIA was unsafe for the operator because of the exposure to radiation. Do you know anything about that?
I'm afraid I don't, Sir Brian. No.
Because it's just interesting to me that the RIA test appears still to have been in use generally, at least in your region, on the 31st of March. Do you know if it happened to be in use elsewhere at that time?
I'm afraid I don't.
Yes, it's something which I'll take up with my team later, and just see if we can understand what, if any, problems there were with the test, and if it wasn't satisfactory in 1985, when it might have been introduced earlier than the test that was used, it should have remained satisfactory for hepatitis B surface antigen.
So that was a document from January 1991. If we can then turn, please, to NHBT 5015_066. A letter from you to Dr. Gunson in May 1991, 13th of May. You say this: thank you very much for inviting us to participate in a 3-centre trial of the 2nd generation hepatitis C virus antibody kits. And you enclose an internal memorandum which has been circulated to senior members of staff. And Mr. Rogan, who is in charge of your transfusion microbiology lab, was getting everything ready. It then says it's not, however, considered feasible for us to implement this testing by the end of May. It's to be hoped that we can be up and running by the 17th of June 1991, and every attempt will be made to start earlier if this proves to be possible. It's our intention then, once screening is established on blood donations, to continue to the time of the recommended starting date for screening of all donations of blood and plasma, i.e. the 1st of September 1991. Firstly, how did Liverpool come to be one of the 3 centres involved in the trial?
don't know. I can't really remember.
That's fine. We can see there that it was hoped that it would start on the 17th of June 1991. Does that sound about right for when it did in fact get going?
It was certainly sometime in June.
And we saw there the reference to an internal memorandum. If we can turn to it, NHBT 5015_065. It appears that this is the memorandum that was referred to because we can see at the bottom of the page copy Dr Gunson, and it's dated the 13th of May. It says this: as you'll know, it's been recommended by the Department of Health that routine screening of all blood donations for antibodies to hepatitis C is introduced with effect from the 1st of September 1991. The delayed implementation date is recommended by the department since the second generation tests are relatively new and do not yet have FDA licences. It's therefore necessary for them to undergo validation in the hands of the service. The Mersey and North Wales Regional Transfusion Service has been asked to participate in a 3-centre trial for a minimum period of 6 weeks to test the ortho kits of the second generation on all blood donations collected during that period of time. Plasmapheresis donations will not be included during this study. Do you have any recollection, Dr Motley, why plasmapheresis donations were not included?
No.
There's then reference in relation to any donors with a positive result being referred for antibody tests to be repeated, and then on to the PHL. Final paragraph of the memo: any donations found locally to have a positive hepatitis C antibody screening test result will be discarded, and a note made on the donor record for appropriate follow-up at the time of their next donation. Since this activity forms part of the validation of a new laboratory test, donor counselling and follow-up will not be undertaken as a result of findings which antedate routine screening of all donations. Is it right then that donors who tested positive were not told of that result in this study?
It must be.
And therefore there was also no follow-up for those donors?
Not for that donation.
There was simply a note where there would be some form of follow-up if they donated again. Is it also right then that for those donors there was no, at that stage, no look back in relation to their previous donations?
I don't think so.
Do you know why that was? Why donors were not told and follow-up was not provided to them?
No, and with hindsight, I think it should have been. I don't know. I just don't know.
That memo obviously refers to the nationally agreed start date for testing on the 1st of September. But is it right that in effect, in relation to blood donations, not plasmapheresis, in relation to blood donations, the Liverpool Centre was effectively screening prior to the 1st of September 1991?
Yes, because we didn't stop. We just carried on once we got going.
And what happened in relation to the frozen stock?
Well, that was tested during that time period.
So that as at the 1st of September 1991, were you confident or not that all the blood and all the blood components that were leaving the centre from that date had been tested?
Yes, I was confident of that.
The inquiry's also heard evidence that Dr Lloyd in Newcastle decided to commence testing on the 1st of July 1991. Could we turn to another memo of yours, Dr Martlew, NHBT 0071652_001, please? This was a memo from you dated the 9th of May 1991 to Centre Consultants, where you say, please find enclosed the latest bombshell from Newcastle and my response. The memo enclosed Dr Lloyd's letter, which the inquiries looked at before, sir, so I won't take you to it, Dr Motley, and also your response. Your response is at NHBT 5074_031. And you wrote to Dr Lloyd, thank you for your letter advising me that you propose to introduce hepatitis C antibody testing in advance of other centres. It's unfortunate you feel unable to wait for the coordinated national approach, which has become the accepted practice within the service. Why did you write to Dr Lloyd in those terms?
Because, well, for the same reasons really that we were discussing with the introduction of HIV screening, I shared what I felt was the general view that we were better to introduce universal screening on a single date in the United Kingdom.
And in your memo to colleagues, you described that as a bombshell. Why did you consider it to be so significant?
Well, it seemed a surprise that he should want to sort of go off unilaterally, if you like, starting testing.
Much the same as we discussed in relation to HIV testing.
Yes,
Would that
yes,
not...
and this was, I mean, I wasn't there at the time, but I felt that this had been based on the experience of senior colleagues, because they felt that the hepatitis B screening introduction in the early 70s had not been satisfactory.
But in the same way, by waiting for a nationally agreed date, once again, did that not cause a difficulty that you ended up with the lowest common denominator, the centre who was the latest?
Yes, I mean, the same, I would agree, you know, the same argument is there.
And with the benefit of hindsight, do you think that testing should have started in each region as soon as they were ready to go ahead?
It would have been beneficial for the recipients, I can see that, but still it would have been difficult for the donor handling, unless one were to, you know, discard until confirmatory testing was available.
I want to move on to a new topic, Dr Motley, and that is in relation to record keeping. When you first went to Liverpool in 1988, everything was on paper records, is that right?
Pretty well, yeah.
How far back did those paper records go?
I'm afraid I can't remember.
So when a donor session was held in a village hall, for example, when it was paper records, how were the logistics of that managed?
The panels, the geographical panels, with the sort of donor demographics were kept actually, I think, in drawers that you could take out, you know, and filed accordingly in alphabetical order. Anything to do with donor referral medical matters was kept in a completely separate place, and there might be an illusion on the donor card that there was some further information elsewhere, but that wasn't available to clerical staff. Everything was compartmentalised on a need-to-know basis, and similarly, all the donation records were on paper, big ledgers and so on, and there were unique donation numbers that went with the donor. So the laboratory staff might find a property in a donor. If it was a clinical matter, that would be found on their clinical record in one place. If it meant deferral, then there would be an instruction to defer from the geographical panel, if you like.
And just to be clear, if an individual usually donated in one region, but now they were donating in your region, you wouldn't have access to their records from, say, Manchester or London?
No.
Could we have WITN 4034003, please? Of course. WITN 4034003, please. If we can just zoom into the top left article, thank you. In about September 1989, Liverpool introduced a medical file to the records. Is that right?
That's right.
And we can see here an excerpt, I think, from a paper given at a conference in a conference called Transfusion Management in September 1990. And it's headed "The Medical File, a Systematic Approach to Donor Deferral" by Dr Shepherd and yourself. And it says this: increasing standards for medical surveillance of blood donors and the importance of details of foreign travel in connection with microbiological screening have created a need for a comprehensive system for reporting of clinical information about donors from mobile sessions to consultant medical staff at the centre. As we serve a territory with wide demographic variations, there's also a need for consistency, whether the donors are in city centre venues or at rural sessions in mid-Wales. Just pausing there, what was the issue that you were concerned with in that regard?
Perhaps that we might hear more about donors in the city than problems that had been detected in a remote Welsh collection site, I think.
And why was that?
Well, I don't know. Probably, or maybe as well, it's a question of describing the deferral categories. So that there was less room for interpretation, if you like.
Just so that we understand this a little better, could you help us with where the records for the rural Wales donors were kept? Did they come all the way back to Liverpool each time, or were they at your Welsh bases elsewhere?
I can't really remember. I think they may have been at the Welsh bases, but I'm not sure. But the information for the medical file came back with the return bleed sheet with a confidential letter from the doctor about the donor.
Including when there had been a Welsh donation session?
Oh, indeed, yes. I mean, all the clinical health matters were dealt with at the centre in Liverpool that were referred. The Welsh outposts were sort of nursing area plus some locally employed medical staff and a place to park the vehicles.
And then you describe that you've established a novel method of data collection. Then it says this: this is a development of the laboratory file used at some centres, but it's under medical supervision and is designed to preserve confidentiality. It incorporates an inbuilt system of standard letters to donors or GPs to deal with common deferral situations, and also includes reportage of blood counts on anaemic donors. Can you tell us just a little bit more about what this system was that you had introduced?
So basically, and all the medical queries or medical deferrals, like were reported to the consultant who was in charge of donor care, which was Dr. Shepherd. And he then would advise the donor on their health, or say if they needed to be deferred, or they needed a referral, or if they were anemic, might write to the doctor, or that sort of thing.
And then you say, after 12 months of use, the system has facilitated the rapid exclusion of unsafe donations from use, with associated withdrawal of donors, and also enables swift retrieval of data on any donors who re-attend. Correspondence with donors and GPs has been streamlined with a very favourable response by both parties. Just in relation to that first sentence, that the system's facilitated the rapid exclusion of unsafe donations, why was that? How did the system assist in that regard?
Well, if somebody should be deferred and they've been told they shouldn't come again and they turned up again, then the donation would be discarded, because there would be no to the medical file as far as the lab were concerned, who would then ask what should happen to the donation. And then, of course, you'd have to approach the donor again and say, look, you're not supposed to be coming. The donation, of course, would be discarded.
And then, in terms of computerisation, that was introduced in the Liverpool Centre in about 1990.
Yes, it wasn't. It started in different parts and different bits, if you like. As far as I can remember, the donor demographic computerisation preceded the laboratory system, which was, very the checking was very painstaking in big ledgers, which had to be checked by two parties manually. And I think that was computerized something like 1990, and was probably the last bit. The medical file, at the time I was there, was still on cards in the medical department. They're not filing cabinets.
And even once that computerisation was introduced in 1990, it was still a local computer system. Is that right?
Yes.
And so there was still no coordination with other regions to enable the passing of information between regions?
No, I mean, I don't think that happened until Pulse did it in the 90s.
So I'm about to move on to a new topic of look back. I noticed the time. It's going to take me more than 5 minutes to deal with look back. Might it be a good time to take a slightly early lunch today so that we pick it up after lunch?
Yes, well, we'll do that. We'll break now until 1:55. 1:55, Dr. Martlew.
Thank you.